Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 14. In the Grip of Darkness. Gareth felt the blood slowly trickle down his chin to drip onto the clasp of his cloak. His hands were fastened firmly behind his back, and he could not reach up to wipe it away. He was grateful for the opportunity to catch his breath. His captors had kept up a blistering pace all the way out of the city, dragging him along, half suffocating in the hooded cloak, the blade of some or other sharp object prodding his back. Perhaps now that he could sit down for a moment or two, the nosebleed would stop. His head still hurt from the rough handling of earlier, and he felt sick and dizzy. He tried not to think of the others. It only made him feel worse. There was no doubt that he was on his own. The cold night air flowed about him in soothing waves. The skin round his mouth was stiffening. Soon the blood would congeal and the horrible dripping would stop. He tried to draw the air slowly through his nostrils to help the process along. A rough hand dragged back the hood, gripped the hair at the back of his head, and pulled till he was looking up at the stars. The face of a man appeared very close to his.
"What are you sniffing for?"
It was a brutal face, accustomed to rough usage. The eyes were wild and open too wide to belong to a sane person. The face was framed by a thin beard and the teeth stained. Stale breath reeking of Fen washed over Gareth.
"I'll give you something to sniff about."
There were two more men on the side of the roadway, breathing heavily. The group had evidently not paused for his benefit alone.
"What's wrong with you?"
If the man had to ask, there was no way of offering an explanation he would understand. The boy's answer was almost comical through the flow of blood.
"Nothing."
The words sounded sullen even to him. The man yanked his hair painfully and started shouting.
"Don't say a word. Don't talk to me. Not a word."
Gareth gave him a pained look. What did the fellow want? Why ask a question if he wanted no response? The hood was dropped back over his head. A mumbled conversation commenced among the men. He could make out the word witch. Were they afraid he would enchant them in some way? It was almost amusing. The men lingered till Gareth started feeling the cold again. Perhaps they were waiting to meet someone, for they did not seem fatigued anymore. He started getting drowsy despite himself. The pain had drained away his energy. The throbbing in his head was growing worse, but at least the bleeding had stopped. The voices flared up suddenly. There were footsteps. Others had joined the party. Was he allowed to look? A savage kick almost sent him sprawling.
"Get up!"
He had struggled to his knees when a hand gripped him behind the neck. Immediately the pain made him gasp. There was a sharp reprimand from someone, and he was released to struggle to his feet by himself. A new, unknown voice spoke close by.
"We'll take it from here."
There was the sound of coins changing hands, laughter from his captors, friendly greetings. Were these mere slavers? It couldn't be. Galia was a more sophisticated creature than to have such low thugs operate in her tavern. Something else was afoot. Again the hood was pulled back, but gently this time. A hand gripped his chin, and a lantern was brought close to his face. Quick words were exchanged in a language he did not understand, although he caught a few words, Viron and Heron Inrath among them. He glanced at the men who had bought him. They were bearded also, but theirs were neatly trimmed. There was a golden sparkle at their throats, and the cloaks were clean and of good material. He had the impression that they were of darker complexion than his captors, possibly men from Phesian ancestry. He was turned around again and flinched as one of the men brought out a knife. Had they paid for him only to slit his throat? He felt the blade slip through the rope round his wrists. The unexpected act caused him to turn and stare at them. He must have looked real silly, for they smiled. The one without the knife brought out a chain with a wrist manacle attached to it. His voice was soothing, as if he was addressing a nervous animal.
We shall not hurt you, boy. Stretch out your hand.
Gareth did as he was told. There was no alternative. The manacle clicked shut. The man shoved the length of chain through his belt and slipped a locking pin into place. He seemed well accustomed to such actions.
Keep up. We have a long way to go.
Gareth worked up his courage to ask.
Am I a slave?
There were grins from the men. Then the one with the chain nodded.
You could say so, but certainly worth more than most.
Then he shook his head again.
In fact, you are much better than a slave. You can consider yourself a special delivery.
They laughed for a while about this silly comment. There was still a chuckle or two when Gareth could no longer see the light of Munborg behind him. Rune flung himself down on the bed. Something was wrong with the wine in this place. Already his consciousness had pulled away from the pleasant forgetfulness he had worked so hard to attain. The cursed little note would not leave him be. He wondered about Tyro and the boy. Had they been sorry to leave? The boy had said so. What a time to run for Karth's Isle. It was dangerous just to move about at night in this place. Had they been taken? Had they escaped? He did not know, but why then did he feel such keen regret? He slept later than usual. Yet when he woke it was still dark in the room. Could it be evening already? He remembered. The dark days had arrived. Someone had brought wash water into his room. It had cooled down already. How had they gained entrance? Had he forgotten to lock the door? Munborg made careless fools of everybody. Rune felt surprisingly good. He had obviously not drunk enough the night before. He dressed quickly. The sight of the empty bed next to his made him uneasy. He told himself that it was better that the boy was out of it now. Had he not told him to stay away, it was better for all concerned. The courtyard was deserted as usual. As he closed the door to his room behind him, he had the distinct impression that he was the only guest remaining in the Silver Swan. Should that trouble him? "We are prisoners," the boy had said. He stopped. There it was again, that freakish, mind-jolting sensation he had felt in another courtyard. In the night, that strange night. Suddenly his skull was too small for his awareness. It was intolerable to be trapped in this mortal frame, to be so blind, so limited. Rune pressed his fingers to his temples and gritted his teeth. This was how one lost one's reason, he told himself. Get control of yourself. Slowly the numbing impression ebbed away. He opened his eyes. Something shiny lay hidden in the soil of the flower bed closest to the entrance. He dug it out with his fingers and rubbed it on his coat. It was a silvery medallion on a broken string. A memory stirred. Evrain had given such an object to the boy, and this was an Aranite coin. He grew cold. Gareth had been taken, right here outside his door while he had been sleeping. And if they had come for the boy, would they not come for him next? Unthinkingly, he tied the string around his neck. There was a twinge of remorse, quickly repressed. So the dear Galia was up to something sinister. Two could play at these dirty games. Now at least he had been warned directly. Munborg was undergoing a transformation. Long lines were strung between buildings in all quarters of the city, from the poorest and most squalid to the small estates of the rich and influential. Lamps of colored glass, tiny balls of crystal, and small wooden lanterns with various shapes cut into their sides were attached to these ropes Soon a sea of lights filled the dark spaces between street lamps. Bonfires were lit in the harbor, and dried bark, yendel leaves, and even flowers were cast in at intervals. The sweet smell of incense spread through the entire city. There was dancing in the streets. Desert drums resounded in every square or large courtyard. The shrill squeal of pipes and flutes competed with chants and songs. Cymbals clashed and horns bleated. The normally rowdy Watersidians were put to shame. Rune made his way from one crowded street to the next. The folk of Munborg had donned masks of a stupendous variety and extravagant designs. Some were simply grotesque, supposedly representing demons or gods whose appetites were clearly written on their countenances. Uncomfortable thoughts of the beast he had seen in the Dankwood were revived. He shrugged them off, convincing himself that he was being childish. Kalia had supplied him with a modest affair made of thin bark. The top half was painted black and the bottom white, with an odd symbol in red on the right cheek. She had assured him that it was an ancient sign representing virility. He had laughed and told her he did not need a sign for that. Ale flowed everywhere. It was potent, more so than the common varieties used throughout the cycle. Each purveyor boasted of his wares as being more volatile than the next fellow's. Dreams were locked inside the brew, visions of great things, sensations to be experienced. The poorest man might be king for a night or conquer the hearts of all he wished. Of course, it was mostly untrue, but one could easily fall into the rhythm of these false promises and believe them for a 10-day. After all, this was the same stinking, rotten Munborg of yesterday, wearing its coat of colored lights and gaiety. But nobody cared if they were being fooled. They drank in the deceit like nectar, choking on the sweet temptation. The night lasted forever. There was no interruption of the dawn to bring a reckoning, a return to the normal drudgery of dismal life. On and on went the cycle of revelry and drunken song. If one was overcome, the awakening would bring more opportunity, for the day was still far off. Lauren's laughter, they called it, the sound that had spread through Imran's garden, when his wife had chosen another to fill the emptiness of her heart. Now it echoed in the streets of muddy, vulgar, lantern-lit Munborg, and much for the same reason. It was the festival of complete abandon. The good citizens would count the cost of it in the new cycle ahead. The Ephesian men kept a steady pace, but allowed him time to rest. They also fed him regularly, and there was none of the brutality he had experienced at the hands of his initial captors. Apparently, these men had business acumen, and would not have their goods spoiled. They marched along the highway, leading eastwards towards the swamp country. Gareth grew apprehensive as they neared the outskirts of what he suspected to be the Dankwood. He remembered the vivid account Rune had given in Arryn and again in Fenvale. Somewhere among the trees ahead lurked a creature of unmatched power and malice, a beast of potency that could dismay the Viron of old. The men with him did not seem to know about such things. They were immersed in casual conversation or the exchange of pleasantries. How the potential sale of one half-sized slave could put them in such high spirits was a mystery to the boy. Their good-natured, if somewhat wicked, exchanges were infinitely more endurable, though, than the insane shouting and violence of the previous lot. There was no chance of escaping. During the day he was never released from the manacle, and the end of the loose chain was either tucked into the one's belt or held wrapped round his hand. At night they passed the chain round a stout tree and locked it to his manacle. At least he could then maneuver out of sight to wash or relieve himself. The sun no longer showed itself during the day. The countryside passed by in dismal darkness, a true reflection of his gloomy thoughts. Garth would know by now that he had been taken. Would it matter to him? What could he do anyhow? The great battles had started all over. One small boy could not be of any importance to him now, if he ever was. He had been an amusement, that was all, someone with whom to pass the time. He couldn't really be of value to such great people as Garth or Rune. A sharp pain formed in his chest at the thought of the latter. Where was he now? Was he also being led down some road to his sinister end? Would he ever see him again? And if he did, would the man still feel the way he did at their last parting? 5 days had passed before he began to suspect where they were taking him. Instead of skirting the Hulam marshes and keeping an eastern heading, they turned towards the north at the parting of the ways. These men were not going to the Fez. They were marching directly into Trilogy. A creature had made its way down into their cave. Paralyzed with fear, the four watched it dashing itself against the bars of their cell. It was not as large as they had expected, but the vicious snarling, the raking of its claws against the iron, the horror of the left arm with its razor-sharp hooks, kept them huddled against the far wall, swallowing their screams in case more prowlers were about. The powder did not seem to affect it, even when Maris flung a quantity into its face. It merely became more agitated as he approached the bars, letting out a hoarse bark and flashing its fangs at them. Hours passed before it seemed to tire. The thing squatted on its haunches in front of their cell. The skin was tight over its hairless skull. Small, dark, wicked eyes appraised them. There was no nose to speak of. 2 slits above the wide mouth moved slightly as it breathed. For a while it scratched in the dirt, as if it meant to dig its way into the cell. Then it examined the wall and the fixtures of the door. The creature had absolutely no fear of them. Even when Maris readied the spear for a lunge, it paid him no heed. The youth rushed forward and struck it with all his strength. He felt the blade go home into the creature's abdomen. The swarmling let out a horrific scream, and the spear was wrenched from Maris' hands. It retreated clumsily out of the reach of their torchlight. For a while they could hear it thrashing about in the cell next to theirs. When they could no longer make out the labored breathing, Maris decided to take a look and retrieve his only weapon. He insisted that they fasten the gate as soon as he was outside. The woman would never be able to hold it against the type of ferocious onslaught they had already witnessed. Kira tried to dissuade him, though she knew it would be futile. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them tightly to her stomach to keep them steady. Tentatively, holding a torch in front of him, Maris rounded the corner. He tried to move silently, though certainly the thing had to have heard the clang of the shutting gate. It had pulled out the spear. Lying on its side, the creature appeared quite dead. Black blood had spread around the corpse, oozing from the mouth that was agape as if it had suffocated. Perhaps the spear had pierced its lungs. Maris picked up the weapon and prodded the prostrate form. There was no response. Immensely relieved and encouraged, he returned to the cell.
It is dead.
He informed the wide-eyed waiting group.
You are sure?
Haldred asked.
Quite sure.
Maris showed her the bloodied spear. To Haldred's horror, Arid reached out a hand and touched it. She was about to berate the child when a noise outside caused them to freeze. It had come from the main cavern, faint but clear, a splashing of water. Maris mouthed the word Ra. Haldred nodded. They breathed again. The more of those vicious bats dropped into the lethal pools, the better. They closed the gate and settled down to await another day. Soon they would have to make a move, for very little remained in the way of food. Water was also running low, but not critically as yet. Where they would get supplies to cross the desert, they could not guess. Haldred woke to gnawing hunger pains. Her body was stiff and sore from sleeping on the straw-strewn stone floor. She dared not lift a hand to rub her eyes, for the grimy powder still covered everything. Today she had to get out of these pestilential caverns or lose her mind. Even if the entire swarm stood ready to devour them as soon as they stepped outside, she felt it no longer mattered. This fearful, filthy, uncomfortable existence had to end. They all sensed a change in the cavern outside. Perhaps it was brought on by the sickly smell floating through the doorway to the cells. It was the smell of death, suffocating and strong. The four donned the remaining powder, gathered their paltry possessions, and formed up to listen at the door. Collectively they held their breath. The main cavern was as silent as the grave. Maris led the way with a brisk pace. Behind him walked Arid, with Haldred holding onto his cloak. Kura brought up the rear. The stench was unbelievable. They pressed veils and scarves over their mouths as they hurried over the causeway. Bloated bodies were floating everywhere. Despite the horror of it, they were heartened by the sight of the damage they had done. Haldred imagined the scores of lives they had saved by their actions, and thanked whatever gods had afforded them the opportunity. It was night time outside the cave. Cool, fresh air washed over them in the entrance, where they huddled once more, uncertain. No sounds came to them from outside. There were no quick, scurrying footsteps of marauding swarmlings, or the heavy steps of Hekan's guards to be heard. What were they to do? It seemed that the swarm had departed. Would Hekan remain where he was? Would he advance in the wake of his scourge? Haldred knew they would have to make a quick decision. To head southwards would be impossible now. They no longer had food enough to make the trip over the desert. But where then? To Lysan? Previously that would have been the only option. But now the land would be laid waste by the horrors Hekan had bred. Would there be a mouthful of food anywhere for them to find? Should they not wait here for the arrival of Hekan's army? Should they not beg him to be merciful, and take them as slaves? He no longer had a swarm to feed them to. Perhaps he would let them live. But the very thought of that cold-blooded murderer made her search for an alternative, however uninviting. Lysan it would have to be, if they could survive the 5-day trek. Whatever had remained of Hekan's tent city had been ripped apart and trampled beyond recognition. Piles of shredded canvas and mangled supports lay strewn amidst the furrowed sand. There were tracks everywhere. It was impossible to tell in which direction the swarm had departed. They hurried over to the former palace cistern. It appeared to be intact. Haldred fumbled with the tap, her fingers suddenly clumsy. At the first sign of water, they gave little squeals of delight. They each drank their fill of the sweet, clear liquid before thrusting their water skins under the spout. Only once these could take no more did they splash the precious substance over their faces and hands. There was nothing to be done about their filthy garments for the moment. Haldred believed there would not be a morsel of food anywhere to be found in the vicinity of Freyne's Point. The swarmlings had certainly scoured the place for anything edible. Yet a half-hearted search of the wreckage revealed the quantity of spoiled supplies Hekan's retreating minions had to have left behind. The fruit had wasted away to such a degree that they could not risk eating it. There was a bag of raisins and a handful of dried figs scattered in the sand that could be salvaged. The greatest find were several bags of flour, ripped open and with some of the contents scattered, but with more than enough remaining. The fact that the swarmlings had merely messed about with these edible stores revealed something of their nature. They were exclusive meat-eaters. Stilling the immediate hunger cramps with figs they rinsed with water, Aldred and her companion set about making a cooking fire. They laid out flat stones and constructed a little mound for baking bread. With so little in terms of ingredients, the resulting loaves were flat and almost tasteless, if it was not for the handful of raisins they added to each. As quickly as they could, Aldred and Cura prepared cake after cake, consuming them as they were baked, till they could eat no more. Now they started filling the bags. Maris was slicing up canvas with Aldred's knife to fashion rough backs. They were all anxious to be away. Hickan's men could appear at any moment. Lauren's eyes touched the horizon when they set out at last. Though the darkness of the day was depressing and sad, it kept them from being exposed to the excruciating desert sun. They decided not to give Arid anything to carry. The boy would slow them down as it was, and might have to be carried in turn before they had gone too far. At 2 miles from Frane's Point, they spotted the dark line of tent wreckage ahead. This had to be what remained of the harem Heckan had condemned to swarm bait. They halted to stare at the distant sight.
We should not pass too close.
Aldred placed a hand on her son's shoulder. Maris turned to face her.
We will give it a wide berth. There can be nothing of value there.
Feeling a little sick, they regarded the deep gully marked out by the passing creatures. Heckan's ploy had worked. The swarmlings could not resist the prey so close at hand. Then they had picked up the scent of the fleeing slaves and followed them across the sands to where the towns of Lysan beckoned. Aldred looked behind them. Heckan would certainly come this way. He would have no qualms about passing through the destroyed camp ahead. Perhaps it was best for them to head in a northerly direction. Once they had sighted the mountains to the north, they could work their way westwards towards Breck. That way the following army would not catch up to them. Surprisingly, it was Cura who first succumbed to fatigue. She just sat down somewhere during the afternoon and told them she felt sick. Her body was trembling all over. They halted for over an hour and let her lie down. She did not have a fever, and Aldred did not think she was ill. It was perhaps the tension, hard work, and malnutrition of the past days that had left her depleted and weak. When they were ready to go on, Maris took her pack to carry it for a while. They kept moving in a northerly direction, away from the trail of devastation. There were long stretches of caked earth in between the shoals of loose sand. Keeping to the firmer sections aided them tremendously. By the time they stopped for the night, a good 10 miles had been covered. Mid-morning of the next day, they spotted 2 figures in the distance. Maris dropped his pack and held the spear at the ready. In the dark, it was difficult to make out what they had seen. Should they approach? What could it be but wandering swarmlings? Aldred peered intently at the shapes. They were not moving. One appeared to be seated on the ground. These were not monsters.
They're human.
She shouted.
One is hurt or worn out.
Tentatively, they made their way towards the figures. The standing one whirled about when he spotted them, but the one on the ground did not even lift his head. They were slaves. A boy of about 15 with brown skin and straight black hair hanging to his shoulders, and an elderly man wearing nothing but a dirty white loincloth. The boy answered their questions with a heavy Southland accent.
We are from the Federation.
He said,
One cycle now we spent in this horrible place. My grandfather,
he pointed to the old man.
he said to go out of the way here, or those things will get us. But we have no water, no food.
He raised his hands together in a supplicating gesture.
You have water? For us?
Aldred nodded.
A little, not much.
She measured out a cupful for each of the slaves.
We have to save it for the crossing.
She motioned to the west.
The swarm is past. You two will come with us.
That same day, Hickan's advance guard reached the site at Frane's Point. By pure chance, they discovered the little mound made for baking bread, but thought nothing of it, till the curious smell floating from the easternmost caverns attracted their attention. A hasty inspection revealed the source in the closest and most extensive of the 3 cave systems. But they could not linger here, for the raw powder had gone, and they would be defenseless against any remaining creatures. Here then also was the clue to what had occurred in the pools. When connected with the curious little oven, an interesting scenario suggested itself. Hekan would be furious to find that someone had been meddling in his affairs. The walls of a fortified city loomed up ahead of them, but Gareth's captors did not approach it. Instead, they marched past it to make camp about 3 miles to the northeast. Gareth questioned them as soon as he got the chance.
What place is that?
One of the men shrugged.
That is Xerox. Not a very friendly place for visitors.
The other man laughed at this and added,
Men there tend to take what does not belong to them, and they are very rough in doing it.
Like the ones that took me.
The men laughed before replying.
Oh no, these are a little more severe.
They seemed pleased with their own cleverness. Now would be the time to ask them.
You are taking me to Lakeside.
There was no hesitation. They had to believe themselves in complete control.
Yes, we will hand you over in Nunmerik.
Merrick, the lair of the hooded man. All the terror of that painful touch at the mirror pool came back to him. The creature was nightmare itself, but potently real. The tree, now they would put him on a tree also, and the shadow would come to stand over him, to touch him with its withering hands. He would have to get away, but how to do it? He could not overpower 2 such watchful men by himself. Gareth lay on his back, the manacled hand flat against the tree trunk, already turning cold. He would have to be free of this chain. He stared at the dull metal of the manacle. It should be possible to find it like he had found the wet logs in Fenvale. But what could he do with it? Could he force it open? He touched it with his free hand, feeling the texture, the solidity. Then he closed his eyes to look for it. The barrier was insurmountable. The manacle was purposed to keep him prisoner, and his motivation only base debilitating fear. He did not even struggle long before he gave it up. Perhaps the terrific disappointment in Munborg still affected him. Only once the men were snoring in their bedrolls did a different approach suggest itself to him. He was still wide awake. The cold made him sleep lightly and fitfully at best. The Phesians did not have a blanket to spare for their captive. Instead of fighting the bonds that kept him, he ought to find something meant to free him. All he could think of initially were people far away and out of reach. Evrain, Lur, Karthonic, Tyro. Then he pictured knives and blacksmith tools, till finally he remembered the key taken from a pouch worn on the belt of one of the Phesians. When he thought of it, he smiled at what a fool he had been. Gareth straightened up, glancing nervously at the low fire and the sleeping forms. The man still wore his belt. The pouch bulged on his hip. Inside was the key he needed, a solid object, easy to locate. Now he only had to bring it to the lock. The click was louder than he had imagined it would be. One of the men stirred, sat up, and looked at him.
What are you doing?
The voice startled him, and he could not think of anything to say.
It is cold.
He stammered at last. The man regarded him suspiciously. He prodded his partner into wakefulness.
What is it?
He's up to something.
The man rose up and walked over to him. Immediately he saw the open manacle.
What the?
Gareth jumped up to flee, but the men gave him no opportunity. Quickly he was pinned down.
How did you?
The key was discovered.
That's my key.
The men looked at each other.
It was in my pouch.
They stared down at the boy. Out came the rawhide once more, though they mercifully bound his wrists in front this time. The chain was looped round his neck, and the locking pin passed through the links. The wrist manacle disappeared into their pouch. They also tied his feet together and placed him on the ground between them to sleep. The chain was tightly wrapped around the key man's wrist. Gareth sighed. He was no closer to escaping. At least he had moved much nearer to the fire. Though he still had no blanket, it was certainly more comfortable. He dozed off. They kept the hood pulled over his head now, so that he could barely see where he was to put his feet. They walked for what seemed ages and ages. Perhaps the men had lied to him, and they were going to the desert after all. Should they not have reached the horrible Nunmerik by now? Gareth worked at the thongs with his teeth during the night, but his wrists were checked each morning, and the bindings tightened again if necessary. He achieved nothing more than an aching jaw for all his effort. 3 times they rested for what should have been the night. They were deep into the marshlands now. It was the end of the dry season here, and there were few insects about to harass them. The stench rising from the shallow bogs was at its worst, though. Stretches of sandy soil, devoid of any vegetation, appeared among the clumps of marsh grass and lanky reeds. Rotting plants conglomerated everywhere in dark pools of decay. The Phesians seemed perfectly at home in this environment, and laughed at any complaint. Gareth noticed that despite their seemingly amicable manner, they kept a very close eye on him. The further they moved into the marshland, the greater their vigilance became, and the more hopeless things seemed for him. He saw the city before they did, his sight being keener than theirs in the dark. Any town has an atmosphere about it, an impression made even at a distance in the night. Lon Merrick, in its pale, darkening coat, amidst the silent pools of the swamp, seemed to be the very end of Myro, the last outpost for the lost, about to depart into an eternity of regret and misery. Gareth knew instinctively that he would not leave this place again. His breathing quickened till he struggled for air. The roots of bitter evil had settled here, digging into the rotten earth for cycles without count, and in the dark recesses, the secret fastness of hollows unmapped and hidden, lay unspeakable things, crimes committed that would fade the golden sun and drown the stars in gloomy torrents of regret. Nothing now could undo the violent grip of twisted centuries upon the land and the people who had become its thralls. Lost they were, like their city, given to every dark desire and conceivable perversity. And in the center of it, ensnared and yet willing, sat the queen of Imran's garden. The streets were alive and throbbing with festivity. The darkening here was a time for rejoicing, a celebration of the triumph of Lauren the Shadow over Imran the warrior. The harmony in the garden had been broken and could not be mended. There would be no retribution, no revenge, just the eternal laughter ringing on and on. They were laughing now, wildly, drunkenly, lustfully, perversely, laughing and reaching out to touch him in passing, as if he had a part to play in this charade. He was an animal to them, a curiosity, to be prodded and baited till they responded for their amusement. The Phesians were angry. They pushed through the mass of bodies at speed, not caring who they insulted or injured in the process. They were nervous too, for he could be lost in the confusion and make his escape if they did not take care. Shouts of
King's business! King's business!
constantly erupted from them. Malik Julian's palace was quiet and dark. No dancers frolicked about the courtyards or twisted their half-naked bodies round the pillars and columns at the sound of frenzied drummers or ululating women. Gareth appreciated the signs. He might not be at home. This realization allowed him to keep control of his thoughts. He had else collapsed with apprehension. He knew also what would follow his meeting with this monster. As soon as they were challenged by a guard, the Phesians halted in relief. One of them went over to explain. The guard called to another who disappeared into the palace after a brief deliberation. Again they waited, Gareth almost relaxing after the pushing and shoving in the streets. He could breathe again. The wild beating of his heart slowed. Lamps were lit. A uniformed chamberlain appeared. He was different to the others, pale-skinned, with dust-colored hair tied behind his head. But it was his eyes that set him apart the most. They were red like weak wine, with slit-shaped pupils like those of the Viron. Gareth stared. It was the first time he found himself face to face with a Tuur. The man came forward and gripped his chin like the Phesians had done. He was examined closely once more. The man frowned, then nodded as if the specimen pleased him. He gave the guards a short instruction, which Gareth could not catch. The guards each roughly took hold of one of his arms and moved him off into the palace interior between them, leaving the chamberlain alone with the Ephesians. They passed through arched doorways into a great hall. The place was lit by torches lining the walls. Gareth stared at the heavy furniture, the wall hangings, the stark marble twin thrones. One of the men released him momentarily to light a lantern on a low table next to a brass-bound door. Perhaps the master was occupied and would not see him now. There were the festivities in the city to attend. Mayhap he would not bother with his captive till after the darkening. He looked again at the silent seats of the king and queen. Surely the sovereign of the realm would have entertained guests on such a night. It had to be that the king was abroad. The guard lifted the lantern high and opened the door. Gripping him by the arm once more, the man started off into the gaping dark. Soon they reached the stairwell of stone with steps steeply spiraling down. The guards released him. The one with the lantern moved down first, and the other motioned to him to follow. Gareth lifted his bound hands to shield his eyes. The light of the lantern in front was more a hindrance than an aid to the ones who had to descend in the wake of the bearer. Narrow passages with a cobbled floor branched off a small room at the bottom. The men selected one and stepped into it, keeping the boy between them. The air was noticeably different now. It was colder and had a dank smell. Somewhere close by, water dripped onto stone. Gareth listened to the breathing of the guards as they walked. It was almost comforting to hear. They were living beings, at least, among these warrens of the dead. The passage sloped downwards in places, with steps cut into the floor where it grew too steep. Gareth tried to remember the route they were taking, but was soon lost in the many twists and turns. At last they entered a great open place, with a ceiling stretching into the dark dome above. Stone tiers ran in circles round the sunken theater, populated with statues of some kind. Lamps spaced round the upper level illuminated doorways to other passages. To Gareth's relief, they did not descend into the arena. He did not like the feel of the place. Dark deeds had been perpetrated here. Skirting the wall, the men led him to a tunnel opposite the one through which they had entered. As they approached the exit, a curious noise became audible. It was rhythmic, like slow footsteps or drum beats, but had an oddly metallic nature, as of something or someone shaking the bars of an immense cage. Gareth did not miss the furtive exchange of looks between the guards. Whatever was making the noise filled them with dread. The new passage was wider and draftier than the previous one. There had to be extensive chambers beyond. Again they descended steeply, the shaking, rattling sound growing louder all the time. It had to be a person, Gareth decided. No animal he knew of would be so persistently regular in its beating against the bars. Yet the intensity and volume of the sound made it seem much more than a mere man. One could discern the clank of chains being tossed against iron at each pulse of the noise. It had to be a cage. The passage also opened up into a large chamber. They were deep in the earth by now. The darkness was cold and damp, the air almost stale. Enormous metal gates lay just ahead of them. The thumping, shaking noise was coming from inside it. For a panicky moment, Gareth suspected that they would pass through to within sight of whatever was causing it. But the men rushed past in nervous haste, once more taking hold of his shoulders on both sides. They crossed the entire chamber to halt before a sturdy door with heavy iron hinges. The guards knocked loudly and waited. Gareth tried to stop the trembling in his body. He was sure the men felt it, and he did not want them to know that he was afraid. They stood there for what seemed a long time, the light of the lantern playing over the stout frame. A curious gargoyle face had been fashioned round the keyhole. He remembered another keyhole, a doorknob of strange design beyond the small private garden in Belruth Castle. Then, as now, the door would open on things dark, significant and unavoidable. A cry sounded in the distance, faint but long and drawn. It had come from the other side of the door. The scream broke off bluntly, as if it had been stifled. Almost immediately, a key grated in the lock and the door swung open. In the doorway stood a heavy-set man wearing a leather skullcap and apron over his shapeless tunic. He had massive hands, in one of which he carried a torch. Beady, predatory eyes fixed themselves on Gareth. Wordlessly, he motioned them inside. The guards addressed him respectfully, speaking quickly in their rough-edged, forceful language. They had gone but a couple of steps when all three halted abruptly and stared at Gareth. The big man gave a command, and one of the guards turned to go. The other now gripped him in an odd way, holding him almost at arm's length. The stout keeper addressed him for the first time in the track tongue.
You are here for the Queen.
Gareth felt the complete absence of compassion in his voice, an indifference to suffering born from too many cycles in dark places like these. Brutality was simply a matter of expedience for this creature. Since he had no idea why he had been brought to Lakeside, he merely shrugged. Quick as lightning, one of the massive hands gripped him by the throat. He was lifted off his feet and held dangling in mid-air. Foul breath washed over him.
You will answer in a clear and audible way when questioned. We will not have any of your little princely ways here.
He was put down again almost gently. If it had been meant to frighten him, it succeeded. The man was no dumb brute. That much was clear from his speech and the measure of control he exercised over his show of strength. Gareth cleared his throat as carefully as he could. His voice sounded small and defeated.
I do not know why I'm here, sir.
His pulse had quickened at the mention of the Queen. If he were to end up in her hands, it might not be so bad. She might take pity on him and take him out of this place of horror. The keeper motioned with his head for Gareth to move.
Go stand there under the torch and put your back against the wall.
The torch in question was perhaps 40 yards distant. As Gareth walked towards it, he became aware of the objects in the chamber, dimly outlined in the flicker of light. There were many different machines, fashioned of wooden beams and heavy iron. Instinctively, he knew what they were for. A paralyzing dread settled over him. Why had they brought him down here? Where was the Queen? Would she come in time? Chains of different thicknesses were suspended from hooks in the stone ceiling. Pain was a tangible thing in this place, having seeped into the substance of the tables, the floor, the silent walls. Desperately, he tried to calm his reeling mind, searching for some way to defend himself, battling through the blatant dark purpose of every object about him. All he could think of was that these machines of terror had all been fashioned mostly out of wood. Gareth looked up at the torch in silent supplication. He turned around to press his back against the wall. The big doorkeeper was standing over him, a knife in his hand. Gareth tried to swallow. His throat was tight with fear. If they were going to hurt him, he would set the whole place on fire, even if there would be no escape. He would rather perish quickly and take them all with him.
Raise your hands.
He obeyed without wanting to. The cords around his wrists were cut cleanly and expertly to fall at his feet. He dared to breathe again. His stomach was painfully tight, making it difficult. The Tour looked at him in an irritated way.
Lower your hands.
He had not realized they were still raised. Footsteps approached out of the dark from further down the hall. He risked a quick glance in the direction of the sound. The sudden flash of hope stifled immediately when he saw 3 scruffy-looking men walking towards them, one carrying a torch. The lead man had a leering, swaggering manner about him, from his arrogant step to the twisted smile on his lips. He had a few days' stubble on his chin, a badly kept mustache, and lank, oily hair reaching to his shoulders. One could almost smell the stale sweat and sour, ale-tainted breath just by looking at him. His speech identified him as a marshlander, but one who had seen a bit more of Myrtle than the swamps of Turallen.
What have we here, Imus?
The big man did not look up as he replied. His irritation had multiplied.
Nothing that concerns you, Gobran.
The newcomer paid no attention. He halted in front of Gareth and leaned down to peer at him as if he was an insect.
A little Viron. How interesting.
Imus raised a hand as if to remove the man forcibly. At the last moment he thought the better of it.
Step back. I'm working here.
Gobran straightened up and stepped to one side.
Go ahead then.
He leaned against the wall, smiling, but his eyes were filled with hatred. There was a dire and intense rivalry apparent between the two. Imus placed the knife on the table next to him.
Remove your cloak.
He saw what was underneath.
And the surcoat.
The keeper examined the second garment with interest. Gareth was glad he had chosen a plain black surcoat with no insignia. Would these people even know to whom the silver arrow belonged? Next he was instructed to remove his leather wrist braces and boots. Imus had selected manacles from a wide waist-high shelf piled with all manner of fastenings.
Hold out your hand.
Gareth held out his right hand.
The other one.
The keeper measured a manacle against the boy's wrist and nodded. He took down a large hammer and locking pins. Gareth stared apprehensively as the manacles were clinked shut round his left wrist and ankle. These could not be opened again with keys. The removal would require tools and skill. At least Imus did not object when the boy slipped his shirt sleeve underneath the metal of the closing manacle to prevent the inevitable chafing. Gobran had taken up his discarded cloak and was examining the metal clasp.
Copper.
He said in disgust. The inferior quality of the clasp did not prevent him, however, from putting the garment and the surcoat over his shoulder. He looked the prisoner over and remarked,
Let's have that doublet as well.
Imus gave him a foul look but did not object.
Aren't there corpses enough down there that you can rob?
Gobran pretended to be affronted.
He is not going to need it. Come on, boy.
He gripped the doublet from behind and tugged at it impatiently. Gareth struggled to undo the ties. It was a good quality sleeveless garment that had protected him against the cold, and he was angry to have it stripped away by this vulture. Once he had it, the vile man still felt around inside his shirt collar for jewelry, laughing when Gareth shied away. The last thing he wanted was for the swine to get a hold of Evrain's medallion. It was worthless in itself, but that would not deter the thieving marshlander from taking it. Already he was glancing at the bracers, girdle, and boots as if they had more value than discovered at first examination. The manacles had metal loops attached, through which one might pass a chain or rope. Imus was searching the shelf again for the appropriate thickness and length. Gareth became aware of the approach of two more figures from the outer door this time. He was standing with his back to the wall again, hugging himself. The chamber was cold enough, with the men's breath coming in little clouds of mist whenever they spoke. You could feel it pushing into him through the thin shirt where his back touched the wall, and rising up from the stone floor through his stockinged feet. But these sensations were as nothing compared to what he felt as soon as one of the latest arrivals spoke.
Coloring Imus. Color this one.
It was a voice icy as the rhyme song wind. It cut through Gareth like the sharpest blade. He gasped. Had the hooded man arrived after all? Immediately there was a pressure inside his head, invasive and violent. He remembered the hooded figures in the portal veil, battle priests, to tear away your thoughts and penetrate your secret mind. He resisted, thinking of Karth and the ease with which he had broken the minds of the invaders. The pressure ceased.
Color him. Really?
Imus turned to stare at Gareth. Hands moved everywhere behind their backs to make the sign against enchantment.
Oh yes. You may grow wings all too quickly.
The priest joined a little gathering around the boy. He was bald-headed with a large hooked nose and sagging cheeks. Gareth was reminded of Rost, the insidious marshland agent among the mound dwellers of Arryn. There was the same air of practiced malice, the same look of harmful intent. Once again he was scrutinized with deliberate care. Gareth shivered with more than the cold as the piercing gaze swept over him. He noticed how all the heads moved with the priests, as if the true nature of their captive would only now become apparent. Immuz retrieved the little chest from a high shelf. He selected a smaller key and unlocked it. All the eyes turned in his direction as he opened the lid. The priest stepped forward to scratch inside. He brought out a thin band of metal. Dark crystal inlays glistened in the torchlight. As soon as Gareth saw it, terrible dread overwhelmed him. He would have screamed if he had been able to find his voice. Instead, he instinctively retreated into the corner where the table met the wall. His knees were weak, and he sat down on the floor to draw his arms around them.
Bring him.
The priest's command was instantly obeyed. Gobran and the guard yanked him to his feet. They proceeded to drag him back to the table where Immuz had clinched the manacles earlier. He struggled feebly. They pressed him down on his stomach, one hand in the small of his back, the other pushing down on his shoulders. He told himself not to look, but could not prevent his head from turning to where Immuz approached with the object of dread. He could see the sharp spike at the back of it, facing inwards. A rough hand ripped away his shirt collar. He heaved with desperate strength.
Hold him.
He was breathing too fast, his heartbeat out of control. Someone had gripped his head, but he could still see the heavy hammer, the icy spike. Frantically, he searched for the wooden structures, but something resisted him. The cold eyes of the priest appeared in his thoughts, and then there was the sharp pain, the single tap, to drive the half-inch of oblivion into the back of his neck. He screamed now, once, in mortal fear and agony. Cold pincers closed round his throat. At first he thought they had crushed his windpipe. He lay gasping, unable to draw air into his lungs. They turned him round. He saw Immuz's concerned face.
Breathe, you little fool, or we'll all be flayed alive tonight.
He leaned over the boy and shook him once or twice. The piercing pain this action caused in his neck broke through his panic. Air rushed in at last. The big tour helped him off the table and made him kneel with his head on an anvil. Another locking pin secured the collar around his throat. Gareth straightened up, dazed and reeling. A numbness was spreading down his back and into his skull. The priest smiled maliciously.
Now, my little Theron kitten. We'll have none of your tricks here.
Gobran's two guards dragged him out through another door and down a passage to a massive chamber, stretching away beyond the reach of the eye. They stood on a higher level overlooking the torch-lit cavern below. Barred gates were placed at intervals, leading off into the rock walls. The man shoved him forward onto a wooden platform with ropes and pulleys attached to it. They worked the lever once they were on, lowering it gradually to reach the bottom level. There seemed to be no other way to descend the 40-foot drop. Down they went again, through a gate, twisting ever downwards, till at last they reached the passage that seemed level. The men halted at the very first door. They pulled back a heavy bolt and opened it. There seemed to be no key or keyhole.
In you go.
They shoved him in the back into the dark interior. The door slammed and he heard the click as the bolt went home. Gareth looked about him. They had left him no light, but there was a small grate high up in the door, which let through a measure sufficient for him to see by. His cell was surprisingly large. Perhaps it had been meant for more than one person. The number of iron rings embedded in the wall seemed to suggest this also. He counted 14 along the length of the chamber, with 10 more in the wall opposite. Down the middle of the floor ran a furrow 3 inches deep, chipped out of the smooth stone floor. It disappeared into the side walls through small grilled openings. The prisoners would normally be chained to the rings in the wall. He could imagine what this furrow was intended for. There was no furniture whatever, not a bed to lie on or a chair to sit on. There was no straw, no blankets, nothing but the bare stone of the floor and walls. In the corner by the door stood a dirty bucket. Gareth sighed and retreated into the cell as far as he could go, crossing over the furrow to the wall furthest from the door. If he sat here, he could see the grate with its little bit of light. At least they had not chained him. He could move about a little. The manacles were still in place round his ankle and wrist, but the vicious collar had perhaps made them unnecessary. He rested his back against the wall and placed his chin on his knees. Tentatively, his fingers explored the back of his neck. The collar was smooth as glass. He felt a strange sensation in his fingertips when he touched it. A dull, unpleasant vibration made him pull away his hand. It was a poisonous thing, damaging and debilitating. Blood had trickled down his spine unnoticed. His shoulder blades felt cold and half paralyzed. The substance in this collar was a dream of slow death, the ending of day, the coming of all things to ashes and dust. There was no resisting its finality, no escaping its morbid truth. Gareth dropped his forehead onto his arms. He was alone now. Tears started in his eyes, but he fought against them. He realized that if he gave in to them, he would wail like a small child. Outside the cell they would hear him and laugh. He pulled the torn shirt about his shoulders. Suddenly he remembered the string and medallion. Gareth felt about inside his shirt. It was not there. Yet they had not taken it. He would surely have noticed. Evrain's coin was lost. It was a small thing, but he was glad they had not ripped this from him as well. It had probably happened in the tavern. Perhaps Tyro would find it there, or Rune. Maybe it would make him remember that there was good in people besides the bad. Still, he was robbed of the comfort the trinket had given him. Yet he had the memory of it to keep him. He thought of the torture chamber above. It was a relief to be out of it. The tour and their keepers were sinister and cruel, capable of anything. At least they had not tied him to some horrible machine to make him squeal for their entertainment. He was quite sure Gobran would do a thing like that. Imus, though a senseless brute, would only do it when instructed. To him it was merely a task to be performed. He had never imagined a place such as this existed. Evil had been limited to the hypocrisy of the priests, till that dark day in the hills. There he had had a foretaste of the type of evil that would construct an underground world of pain and suffering, and keep it stocked with victims. A man was following him. Rune had little doubt of it. The mask he wore was an even better giveaway than the features of his face would have been. It was easier to spot at a distance, and did not change its expressions with the owner's moods. Would it be Galia's doing? He had not returned to the inn for a night or two, sleeping wherever he found himself when he had the need. That was the custom during the festival, practiced by all the good citizens. Perhaps she was merely concerned about his safety. He smiled at the thought. It would have been so touching, the concern of a woman. The laughing ale was an addictive substance. One did not drink it for the taste, of course, but even the din of the drums and shrilling flutes grew soft before long, gaining in musicality and appeal. The used bodies of dockside trollops gained in shapeliness, and their clumsy drunken movements were increasingly lithe and gracious. And any man thus fortified became a king. His companion of the moment became his consort, his queen, to rule over the hours of darkness by his side. The game became reality. They wanted it to be, and thus it was. Senses were beguiled so easily, slipping from one frivolity to the next, half aware and willingly duped. And everyone was playing along. Everyone took part in the quest for forgetfulness. The woman, if it was a woman, held out something like a pomegranate to him. That was the trouble with these masks. One could hardly divine whether the next person looked even half decent or not. He stumbled away without touching it. In a side alley, two figures grappled. He imagined the one had a knife, which he plunged repeatedly into the body of the other. He snorted and moved on. Tall figures lined the catwalk, laughing uproariously. They leaned over the side to pour wine on the passers-by below. Suddenly they seemed to be crowned with light. The flowing lines of lanterns swayed about them in a slow caress. 3 men were breathing fire, miming the winged motion of the beast. He gave them a wide berth, not remembering why the scene disturbed him. People were dancing at the water's edge, on the dockside walkways. The fire leaped into the sky amidst the braying of horns and the wild motion of naked limbs. They were laughing like demented drunken whores, till they were hoarse and aching and unaware, crawling about in animal abandon. He awoke once in an unfamiliar place, covered by someone else's cloak. The mask had slipped from his face, and he had trouble locating it among the sprawl of bodies under the table. Underneath the throbbing pain in his temples, he was weak with hunger. Yet the sight of half-eaten meals and remnants of fatty, poorly cooked skewers of meat made him sick to his stomach. The cloying Yendel smell had seeped into his skin. His eyes were smarting with the seductive smoke. In his mind turned the slow wheel of dulled appetite for the enticements of this never-ending night. Amazingly enough, the coins he had brought with him from the inn were still in his pocket. He laughed at the sight of them and ordered a large jug of wine. Another drop of that ale might be the last thing he would ingest. The tips of his fingers had a tingle to them, and his body seemed remote and unfriendly. Outside, the night throbbed on in half-true promise and open deceit. A troop of young people dragged him into their playful, enticing game, till he saw where they were heading with him and tried to break free. They became violent, and he escaped with scratch marks and a bruised jaw. The mask had been split in two, and he took a different one from a prostrate form in the street. Screams erupted from the port side. A burning tavern stood against the sky, its flames higher than any bonfire. Figures were leaping from the upper level into the teeming street. Flocks of bystanders pointed, laughing in their besotted way, at the rushing men who spilled more water than was actually poured on the blazing structure. Flames started on a neighboring building, and he fled with the rest, away from the stench of burning flesh and the howling of insane laughter. On the temple hill, the air was cleaner, but also stark and cold. There were fewer lights and no dancing groups of gaiety. Perhaps it was a place for privacy, but also for dealings of a darker nature. He saw a group of young acolytes dragging away the drunken form of a man. Others were hunting about for more. He noticed the eager, slightly fearful gleam in their eyes. In the end, there was nothing to do but stumble back to the Silver Swan. Whatever remained of the festival would have to wait till morning, or what might be morning, he was no longer sure. Rune felt an object pressing against his throat. His entire body complained, and he rolled over to see what it was. His twisting fingers touched the metal of Gareth's coin. All the stale, wine-drenched fog lifted from his memory. In the soothing semi-dark, he gathered his thoughts. He wanted them now. He desired clarity and control. It was wrong. The medallion was out of place. It did not belong here. How could he even wear it? The coin was a token of absolute trust, of affection, of improbable love that ran against history, race, and tradition. Should it not burn a hole in his traitorous skin? The throbbing of the drums invaded his tranquility. He got up to relieve himself. The wash-water had already been brought. Once again, the thought of someone sneaking into his room to place it here for him was annoying. But then he had given any would-be assassin ample opportunity during the last few days. Rune sat down on the bed and removed the medallion. He held it up to look at it. The coin was simple enough, decorated with the image of a boat and the words Arran Rock on the one side. On the other was a bad likeness of Ranald, King of Arran, and the date, Reapage 598. He remembered the boy speaking of the event. His face lit up with excitement even when he was sunk in dejection and gloom. At the thought of Evrain, there was again that little prick of envy he had felt in Arran. Rune dressed quickly. His best clothes would have to be laundered. They were saturated with smoke and incense, besides the spatterings of he could not guess what. How long had he worn them? He was ashamed to realize that he did not know. Somewhere outside was the shattering of glass and screaming laughter. He frowned, dragging a hand over his unshaved face. First things first, he had to find something decent to eat. There was a man lying face down in the courtyard. He was still alive by the soft moaning coming from his unmoving form, but Rune had the impression he would not remain so for long. It seemed that Galia still entertained other guests after all. The drinking hall was a mess of snoring bodies, smashed furniture, and the strewn about remains of whatever they had been served. An animal of some sort, disheveled and unrecognizable, sat on top of a table with its snout in a bowl. A servant entered, looking almost as disheveled as the beast. He had a pitcher of wine and a clean-looking cup in his hands. The man halted in surprise when he saw Rune.
Captain Greystone,
He held out the pitcher and cup.
with Lady Galia's compliments, sir. I was just on my way.
Thank you.
Rune took the pitcher and cup, though the sight of it sickened him. He thought it best not to make his sudden abhorrence plain to the man.
Find me something simple to eat, will you? I'll be in there.
He gestured towards the smaller chamber where he had dined previously with Galia. The servant nodded and retreated in the direction of the kitchen. The fire had gone out in the salon. A young thing was snoring away on a pile of cushions in front of it. Rune looked at the half-naked body in disgust. The Lady Galia had obviously acquired something else with which to pass the time. He stood with the pitcher and the cup in hand, looking for a place to sit down. The person rolled over and moaned softly. Suddenly, Rune had had enough. He was in the pit itself, and found that he had no more stomach for it. He desired nothing more than to be rid of it all. The pitcher became heavy and loathsome. For a moment he considered pouring the contents over the sleeping form, but he was not ready to give himself away as yet. Rune made his way back to the courtyard. He emptied the pitcher into one of the flower beds. Today he would stay in his room, pleading ill health. His decision had been made. He had to leave this place. But he would not inform Galia of his intentions. He would escape from her prison without her suspecting a thing. The bed had not been touched since he had left the room earlier. He pulled off his boots and flung himself down on it. A few more hours of sleep would do him good and certainly dull the pain in his head. There was a knock on the door. The servant of earlier entered with a tray. He had almost forgotten the man.
Captain, I assumed you would be here, considering...
Was the man actually embarrassed?
Yes, thank you. Just leave it there on the bed, and tell the staff I wish not to be disturbed for the remainder of the day. I'm not feeling well.
The man placed the tray on Gareth's empty bed, bowed, and closed the door gently behind him as he left. Rune looked over at the food. At least a few people in Manborg were not blind, drunk, and befuddled during the darkening. Some of these seemed to work in the kitchens of the Silver Swan. There were 2 boiled eggs and a crisp green salad, freshly baked bread with butter, and a thick slice of cheese. An apple, peeled and quartered, framed a thin slice of cured ham. A small pitcher of watered orange juice had been added as an afterthought. They certainly did not expect him to drink that after consuming so much wine. He fell to with a good appetite. It had to be close to noon already. Galia stroked the soft hair of her lover absent-mindedly. So Prince Rune had walked in on the poor boy while he was sleeping here. She wondered what he had thought. Not that it mattered any more. They had never been intimate. There had only been the suggestion of it. And now that the suggestion had faded away, it was too late for the little fly to escape the spider's web. She smiled to herself. His appetite was his undoing. Again he had accepted the spiced wine. He could not resist. She laughed out loud. And this time he would not even taste the subtle undertones of her concoction. The sleeping draught would keep him there till well into the morning, and tomorrow would see the arrival of Lord Malik in Manborg. What a moment of triumph awaited her! It was the crowning glory of a most rewarding darkening festival. The youth moaned softly and nestled closer under her caress. How charming he looked as he slept! She almost regretted the festival to be over. It had been a most excellent diversion. Yet it mattered not, for soon she would have the pick of Tiralan's most virile youth as her worshippers. Horan Inranod was not ungrateful. Gareth ate the gruel as quickly as he could. It took but a few moments to empty the little wooden bowl. When he had finished, his stomach still growled with hunger. There was a hunk of bread also, hard and stale, but he devoured it in 2 bites. It tasted of nothing much, but he felt better to have eaten something at last. When they came for his empty bowl and the bucket later on, a jug of water was passed through the grate. He emptied half of it without pausing, though he knew there might not be more for quite a while. At least a day had passed before they had bothered to feed him. The thirst had become a torment worse than the clinging collar. He had not slept much. Dreams of dark things seemed very close here, and he had stayed awake partly out of fear to be overcome by these, and partly because of the cold. He had not needed the bucket straight away, and had turned it upside down to serve as a chair. He did not have to touch the cold floor then, and perched on it with his hands over his ears, trying to remember some of the things Anik had told him about the marshland realm. There were screams, too, he did not want to hear. When one least expected it, a cry would rise up out of the cavernous chamber through which they had passed to get to his cell. It made him start every time, and worked on his nerves. When he had grown hungry again, and began wondering when the next meal would arrive, the bolt of his cell door was drawn back, and 2 men entered. Silently they took hold of him and marched him out, up the passage to the ascending platform. The torchlight hurt his eyes, and he kept an arm raised to shield them at first. Immuz was waiting for him in the chamber of machines. There was no malice in his expression, but then Gareth had not expected any. The tour motioned him over to the anvil, and removed the wrist and ankle manacles. Gareth hoped with all his heart that this would be all he had been brought here for. But then he was led to a large frame, with leather thongs suspended from a crossbar higher than his head. 2 of the big man's helpers waited here. One of them ripped his shirt down the front and pulled it over his shoulders. Now it would start, he thought, and he did not even know what they wanted. Try as he might, he could not turn his thoughts to the wood. As soon as he made the attempt, pain flowered from the collar into his head and down his spine. The shirt fell about his feet, and they gripped his arms to fasten his wrists to the frame. He trembled in their grasp like an animal, all thought of being brave abandoned. A voice spoke behind them.
Release him.
It was a woman's voice, a sweet sound, calm as an untroubled sea. The men froze uncertainly, then stood back from him as if they were embarrassed at the thought of touching him. She spoke again.
Immuz, bring him over here. Let me have a look at him.
Gareth picked up his shirt with shaking hands. If things carried on like this, he would soon have nothing but a rag to wrap himself in, if there was anything left of him to wrap. Elena, Queen of Tirallen, placed a 3-legged stool in the dim light of a brazier. She moved a chair 3 paces back from it and stood waiting. Once he had looked at her, Gareth could not tear away his eyes. Her appearance was striking enough, so sharply contrasted with the rough machines and stark surroundings of the dungeon. On her head was a circlet of gold, over and around which her flaxen hair spilled in coils. Her gown was a deep red in color, and so long it almost swept the floor. A mantle of dark green hue flowed over her shoulders from a gilt clasp below her throat. But what attracted him was her face. The line of her chin, familiar and foreign, her eyes which he already knew would be a dark indigo like the ocean under a setting sun, filled with the sad memories of other times and places. Gareth walked towards her in a dream. His thoughts were filled with the memories of that outcrop overlooking the sea in Fenvale, where he had felt her close to him, while the stars whispered of her terrible regret. He hardly noticed when Immuz pressed on his shoulder to force him down on the stool. Elena's eyes widened. Something was wrong. There was trickery here. This child, staring at her so intently under the soft light of the lamp, was her child. She knew it with her heart, while her mind denied it. Of course it could not be. But why did the heart-rending pain start in her again? Why could she suddenly not find her breath, and had the wild beating of her blood betrayed her so? A hand fluttered to her throat. The blue eyes were fixed on her, and worlds of meaning she read in that gaze. In herself she trembled, and almost spoke his name. But there was no accusation in his mind, no claim to what should have been his. just the terrible chasm of sadness that was her own. The boy was looking at her, the torn shirt forgotten in his hands. Had she remained silent for too long? Had he noticed anything? Elena had not traveled so far and for so long to be undone in front of a specter like this. She would reduce him quickly to what he was, a lost child who had secrets she needed to learn. She looked past the barrier of the collar to catch his thought.
Who are you, boy?
Gareth felt the pressure, but on his side of the pain he could deal with it.
You do not know?
Let me hear it from you.
I am Gareth, born in the house of Fingor Sith Alberad, king of Nuria. A murderer and a thief, whose claims I deny. I am a son of Vale, and of Finwith his firstborn.
How old are you, Gareth, son of Vale?
He expected a mocking tone, but there was none.
I have 12 cycles, for a day or two longer.
And do you know what I want from you?
He looked at her for long moments before he answered. A frown of pain had settled on his face. Incredibly, there was a discernible touch from his thoughts.
Must I say it in front of them?
Aloud he simply said,
No.
Elena looked at the collar around his neck. She had a fair idea what extraordinary effort it had cost him to cross the barrier. But she would not play his game, not until she had gauged his capabilities. He was too much like Veer to be underestimated. She gave no indication that the thought had been received.
Do you know who I am?
He hesitated, searching her face for a clue. When there was nothing, he blurted out,
You are the lady of the garden, the mother of...
She raised a hand.
Silence!
Elena turned to the keeper.
Imuz, I will speak alone with this child.
My lady, we were told...
He has been collared. He is harmless. Besides, do you think a stripling such as this could be a threat to me?
The big man was perplexed. He glanced from one to the other.
At least let me have his eyes out. We do not need him to see anything again.
You will have nothing out. You will leave this instant and take your monkeys with you. Stand there by the doorway. I will call when I need you.
There was no further argument. The three men trooped off to the further end of the hall, taking up their position under the torch next to the outer door. When she was certain that they could not be overheard, she turned sharply on Gareth.
You should learn when to keep your tongue and when to speak. Secrets can be dangerous things.
Again there was the searching for her intention.
But you asked me.
Do not get clever with me. I can see you have a scheming little mind. What is it?
Gareth had doubled over in pain, bringing his hands to his face.
What's the matter with you?
There is a pain when I try to think.
It's because you think in the wrong way. You are trying to use your art, probing, examining, discerning, when you ought not to. That's why they put that thing around your neck.
I can't think any other way.
You will learn.
She moved her chair a little closer to him.
I want to know what you know about me, and who told you. And do not try to tell me lies. I will know when you do.
Gareth was terribly nervous. He knew he had no talent for hiding the truth. Every time he had tried to do it, the consequences had been severe. But this was a mortal enemy to Kale, to Rune, to Veer. He could not tell her all he knew. It would be best to appear confused.
I do not know how it is. Sometimes there are dreams, and I do not want them. They just come.
At least this was true.
About 10 days or 12 days ago, I saw you. Here, and another place. And you were sad like my mother, and sorry about your love that had been lost.
Stop! Stop it!
Helena remembered the touch. The boy who was her son and who was not. The unbearable touch of compassion, of understanding where there could be, where there ought to be none. What was this? How could this be? She was upset. She had to get away. There would be time to deal with this child later. But dreadful curiosity prompted her to ask one more question. The boy still looked at her, seemingly oblivious of her agony.
Just now, when you sent your thought to me, what were you going to say that could not be said in front of them?
She motioned in the direction of the guards. He shrugged and shook his head. He did not remember it.
I asked you if you knew what I wanted from you.
His face was sad again, like a curtain drawn across it. The boy whispered a single word.
Forgiveness.
Elena stared at him, speechless. She was on her feet. The chair clattered to the ground.
He sent you here. He sent you.
Across the room, the guards were running towards them. Her face had changed. It was white as chalk. They handled him roughly. blaming him for the fact that she was so visibly perturbed, their queen who never showed emotion in front of them. They did not ask what he had done, they simply dragged him off to his cell to cast him back into the shivering cold, with an added bruise or two. He pulled on the ragged shirt and overturned the empty bucket for a seat. Now it would be the waiting game for food and water again. But he had so much more to think about. Elena, she called herself, and she did look a bit like his mother. What had she meant with her last accusing words? Who was supposed to have sent him? Did she mean Karth or Veer? He remembered something the old man had said to him in the portal veil, only he had not known it was the veil then.
How right you were to take this form. So much like the Forsaken Son.
He understood it now. The Forsaken Son was Veer, and if he resembled the young Veer in appearance and manner, it would explain much of their strange behavior towards him.
What do you know of the pain I feel at the sight of you? What can you understand of the shame that you are my firstborn and not hers?
But she had known that he was not an apparition born from her guilt, and still she feared what he knew about that guilt. There was a special surprise before the next meal arrived. He heard quick footsteps outside. The bolt was drawn back and his door swung open. Gobran and 2 others came in carrying 2 pails. Without saying a word, they poured the cold water over him, sniggering all the while. They looked at him for a few moments as he sat there gasping, then turned around and left. At first he could not believe what had happened. Was this normal? He touched his wet hair and smelled his fingers. It was only water, he noticed with relief. Was this some sort of retribution for upsetting their queen? Or was it simply Gobran's way of entertaining himself? If they'd wanted him to wash, which he doubted, they could just have left him the water. He shivered violently, drenched to the bone. Gareth removed all his clothes and wrung them out one by one in the furrow. Then he dried himself as best he could with a shirt. He was amazingly cold. Though he had intended waiting for the garments to dry, a tiny draught from the direction of the floor grill made his teeth chatter so badly that he thought they would break. He pulled on the sodden clothes again and installed himself on the bucket. By the time his food arrived, he felt a little better. He dozed off in his damp clothes and fell off the bucket, but he was worn out enough simply to roll over on his side, draw up his legs, and sleep, for once without dreaming. When he woke, it was to the tapping on his door. The guard wanted his bucket.
It's empty,
He called through the closed door. He could not remember whether they normally fetched it in the morning or the evening. His stomach cramped. When did they bring his food? With all the sleeping, he had lost his orientation. The steps of the guard were receding. Frantically, he called after him.
What day is it?
The guard laughed, though Gareth failed to see what was humorous about his question. An old, tired voice answered him.
It's the last day of Darkening. More's the pity. Tonight we have the final celebrations. Then it's the start of a whole new bloody cycle.
Gareth leaned back, placed his hands behind his head, and stretched out his body on the cold floor. It would be the start of a new cycle for him, too. Today was his naming day. He had reached 13 cycles at last. His previous naming day was spent in the Belruth Castle. He remembered the cakes and the syrup of strawberries so sweet you had to water it down. Gwir had fussed over him, partly because that rotten Fengor had ignored him again. There had been gifts also that he already knew had not come from the king. But later that murdering demon Lucane and his pit-spawned father had come smiling, pretending, professing love when they hated him. It was almost better to sit here forgotten in this hole, with little more than his skin, than to be surrounded with the false comfort and lies of Belruth. At least the hatred here was honest. The guards, Gobran, Imuz, made no secret of their hostility. The stone underneath him offered no comfort. It was hard and cold, malevolent. Yes, he would have his naming day celebration here. There were ghosts of men who had perished while hanging from the iron rings in the walls. These were the first guests. They were already there and did not even have to be invited. and they had no need of real food, which was just as well since he had nothing to offer. But there were many things in his memory that he would bring out for them to enjoy. Gareth planned his naming day feast with care. He placed the tables in his kingly hall, spreading them with bright green, such as the new budding hillside grass in Genesis. There were spoons and table knives of bright silver, and napkins at every plate. Uniformed servants stood ready to show each guest to his place. No priests were allowed. They would not even know about it. He hesitated for a moment over his old tutor, but decided in the end to let him in, provided that he did not say anything. There would be no wine or ale, but they could have gallons of that syrupy stuff, and the cold water from the courtyard well. Gwir would stand there rubbing his hands, while the servants brought in all manner of roasted meats with crackling brown skin. There would be great piles of blackroot, sliced thin as paper, with the red carrots of Monostor, tiny and succulent, and sugar peas with the cheesy sauce he loved so well. Then they would bring the great pastries, filled with venison and wild pig and mushrooms, bowls of sliced fruit fresh and chilled in buckets of snow, honeyed cakes with raisins so soft and moist. He saw them eating and laughing. Everyone had a good wish for him. Everyone was happy to be there. It did not take long for him to think of whom he would invite, rather than what he would eat. Captain Melvor could come, but under the same conditions as the tutor, and he was to sit at the far end of the hall. Riot would sit next to him. If the ghosts in his cell were allowed, then so was his friend. He would stare so. Gareth chuckled to himself. Riot would not know where to start with all the good things. And he would tell him which was the best, and that he could really have as much of it as he wanted. He thought of Veer, but the keeper of the towers was too great a lord to come to such a celebration. He would send a message, a scroll with a gilt seal, to wish the boy a happy naming day and wish him well for the coming cycle. Evrain would be there, with Mirael and little Lay, smiling so much, Lur and his kind wife, his boys, Melor and Yulan, the Myrden crewmates who loved him and whom he loved, Anik, Vior, who would still feel bad about the arrow on Yura Beach. Karth would certainly come, even if he was a great lord too. It would be quick for him because he could use the portal veil. There was room still. He looked for others. Old Euban, who had been kind to him in the store. Den, caring enough to tell him his dreadful secret and give him warning about the trap. The unknown woodsman from whom he had stolen a meal outside Lunvir. Uthard, who had saved them in the mounds. Ranald of Arryn and his funny little page. Air, their Vadran guide. Javia and Peric of Finvale. And, yes, Rune would be at the head of the table, in the place of honor, where Fingor would have been had he ever bothered to attend. A tapping broke through his reverie. His gruel had arrived.